Close your eyes and listen. Taxi horns, subway rumble. 8 million voices pressing through concrete canyons. Now strip it all away. Peel back the steel, the asphalt, the glass. What remains is wind through salt marsh. The knock of a wooden hull against a rough-hewn pier. The low murmur of a conversation in Dutch. No, in French. No, wait. In a language you have never heard before. You are standing on the southern tip of an island, the Lenape call Manhattan. The year is 1660. The place the Dutch call New Amsterdam. It has roughly 1,500 residents, 20 taverns, 253 buildings, and no paved roads. In 4 years, it will cease to exist entirely. This is the story of the strangest settlement in the colonial world, and the forgotten blueprint for everything New York City would become. To understand what New Amsterdam looked like in 1660, we are fortunate to have something rare in colonial history. A map so detailed it shows individual garden beds. It is called the Castello Plan, drawn that year by the colony's Surveyor General, Jacques Cortelyou. The map reveals a settlement clinging to the bottom of Manhattan Island, covering roughly the area we now call the Financial District. That is it. Everything north of a wooden palisade wall. The wall that gave Wall Street its name was wilderness, forest, swamp, Lenape trails threading through old-growth oak and hickory. Inside the wall, the settlement was cramped and eccentric. A fort stood at the island's southern tip, Fort Amsterdam, flying the orange, white and blue flag of the Dutch West India Company. From the fort, a wide dirt road pushed northward. The Dutch called it the Herenstraat. Today we call it Broadway. Running roughly through the middle of the settlement was an actual canal, modelled after the waterways of Amsterdam back in Europe. It cut inland from the East River shore, and residents used it for drainage, for transport and, less romantically, as a place to dump waste. That canal ran where Broad Street stands today. The buildings on Cortelyou's map were small. Most were single-story wooden structures with steep pitched roofs thatched in local reeds, their gable ends facing the street, Dutch style. A handful of wealthier residents had imported brick or stone. Nearly every lot included a garden, some formal, some practical. And orchards were threaded throughout the settlement. GIS analysis of the Castello Plan has counted over 300 individual trees. New Amsterdam, for all its ambitions, was still part village, part trading post, part experiment. And what an experiment it was. Because the most remarkable thing about this tiny settlement was not its buildings, it was its people. A French Jesuit priest visiting New Amsterdam in 1643, when the population was barely 500, reported hearing 18 different languages spoken in the streets. By 1660, that number had only grown. The Dutch West India Company had never intended to build an ethnically homogeneous colony. It was a corporation, it wanted profit, and profit meant bodies. Anyone willing to work, trade, or settle. So the colony attracted not only Dutch citizens, but Walloons from present-day Belgium, Germans, Scandinavians, English dissenters, Sephardic Jews fleeing the Portuguese reconquest of Brazil, and French Huguenots. According to records analysed by historian Russell Shorto, by the early 1660s, the colony of New Netherland was approximately 40% Dutch, 19% German, and the rest a patchwork of other European nationalities. Then there were the Lenape, the Munsee-speaking peoples who had inhabited Manhattan for thousands of years did not vanish when the Dutch arrived. They traded with the settlement. Corn, venison, beaver pelts exchanged for European goods and wampum beads. Lenape traders could be found near the waterfront at a house close to the intersection of what we now call Pearl and Whitehall Streets. The relationship was not peaceful. It was not equal. The Peach War of 1655 had seen hundreds of Munsee briefly occupy New Amsterdam itself, and the Esopus Wars were raging upriver even as Cortelyou drew his map. But the Lenape presence remained woven into the daily fabric of the settlement in ways that later English colonial models would actively try to erase. And then there were the enslaved Africans. This is the part of New Amsterdam's story that its mythology of tolerance tends to obscure. The Dutch West India Company was not merely a trading firm. It was one of the largest slave trading operations in the Atlantic world. As early as 1626, enslaved Africans had been brought to Manhattan to build the colony's infrastructure. Literally, they cleared land, they laid roads, they constructed the very wall along Wall Street, they cut lumber at sawmills, they performed domestic labor in settler households. By the 1650s, an estimated 75 enslaved people lived and labored within the boundaries of New Amsterdam. On the Castello plan, historian Russell Shorto has identified a modest building on what is now South William Street, where dozens of enslaved people owned by the company were housed. Their names appear in Dutch colonial records: Paulo d'Angola, Simon Congo, Anthony Portuguese, names that mark origins violently severed. What made Dutch slavery in New Amsterdam unusual was a legal mechanism called half-freedom. Beginning in 1644, the company granted certain enslaved men and women a conditional release. They could live independently. They could farm their own plots of land. A section north of the wall became known as the Land of the Blacks. They could earn wages. But there were conditions that made the term freedom bitterly incomplete. They owed annual payments of crops, hogs, and labor to the company. They could be conscripted for compulsory service at any time. And, most devastatingly, their children remained the legal property of the Dutch West India Company, born into bondage regardless of their parents' status. This was not liberation. It was a calculated economic arrangement. The company reduced its costs of housing and feeding laborers while retaining full ownership of the next generation. On September 4, 1664, just days before the English seized the colony, 8 half-free individuals petitioned the Colonial Council for full freedom. Whether that petition was ever granted is lost to history. What is not lost is the understanding these men and women had, that their condition was specific, constructed, and unjust. They used the legal structures of their captors to argue for their own humanity. Step back now from the broader forces shaping New Amsterdam and look at what an ordinary day felt like inside those walls. The settlement smelled. That is the first thing any modern visitor would notice. Pigs, goats, and cattle roamed freely through the dirt streets until Director General Peter Stuyvesant, the colony's peg-legged authoritarian governor, waged a personal campaign to contain them behind fences starting in 1648. By 1660, the livestock situation had improved somewhat, but the canals still functioned as an open sewer, and household waste was routinely thrown into the road. Stuyvesant governed New Amsterdam the way a strict headmaster runs a school. He closed the colony's 20 taverns at 9 o'clock each evening. He fined residents for brawling. He passed ordinances regulating the weight and price of bread. He tried, with mixed success, to impose the Dutch Reformed Church as the colony's sole religious authority, clashing repeatedly with Quakers, Lutherans, and the small Jewish community that had arrived in 1654. One of those Jewish residents was Asa Levy, an Ashkenazi refugee who had come to New Amsterdam among 23 Jews fleeing the fall of Dutch Brazil. Stuyvesant wanted to expel them. The directors of the Dutch West India Company in Amsterdam overruled him. By 1661, Levy had become the first Jewish person known to own a house anywhere in North America. His story is a compressed version of New Amsterdam's entire identity, a place where tolerance was not a principle but a byproduct, the unintended consequence of a corporation's need for settlers, customers, and labor. On August 27, 1664, 4 English warships sailed into the harbor. They carried a simple demand: surrender. The colony was weak. The Esopus Wars had drained morale. The wall, the famous wall, was in disrepair. Stuyvesant wanted to fight. He reportedly tore up the English letter of surrender in rage, but when he looked to his citizens for support, he found none. The residents of New Amsterdam, that polyglot patchwork of merchants and brewers and refugees, had little appetite for dying for the Dutch West India Company's bottom line. On September 8, 1664, Stuyvesant's lawyer and 5 delegates signed the Articles of Surrender. Not a single shot was fired. New Amsterdam became New York, named for the Duke of York. The canal was filled in. English law replaced Dutch ordinances. The Broadway kept its route but lost its Dutch name. And within a generation, the language of the settlement began shifting from Dutch to English. Though Dutch would persist in New York's churches and homes well into the 1700s, the colony that had existed for 40 years vanished with the stroke of a pen. Or did it? Here is what the English inherited and never quite erased. They inherited the street grid. Broadway still follows the Heerstraat's path. Wall Street still marks the line of the old palisade. They inherited the diversity. That 18-language settlement did not become monolingual overnight. It layered, it absorbed. They inherited the commercial instinct. The idea that a city exists not to glorify a crown or defend a faith, but to facilitate exchange. And they inherited a silence. The land of the blacks, where half-free families had farmed their own plots north of the wall, was gradually absorbed into the expanding city. The African burial ground, where an estimated 15,000 free and enslaved Africans were interred over a century of use, was paved over, built upon, and forgotten. Till construction workers accidentally uncovered it in 1991, just blocks from City Hall. The Castello plan was itself forgotten for centuries. The original is lost, the surviving copy. A replica by the cartographer Johannes Wingboons was sold to Cosimo III de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, in the late 1660s and hung in a villa outside Florence until scholars rediscovered it around 1900. So here is something worth sitting with. The most detailed portrait of New York's origin was kept in a Tuscan villa for 300 years. The most diverse settlement in 17th century North America was run by a corporation. And the wall that gave Wall Street its name was built, in part, by enslaved people whose descendants would be buried in unmarked graves beneath the streets that erased them. New York in 1660 was nothing like today. And also, in ways that matter most, it was exactly like today. If you've learned something new, consider subscribing. We explore forgotten chapters of history every week.